There's an island off the coast of California that you are not allowed to visit. No marked trails, no ferry, no public access of any kind.
And for nearly a century, the US military has been dropping bombs on it. And that island is home to species found nowhere else on the planet, 5 of which just got removed from the Endangered Species List.
And the reason they recovered? The bombs themselves. This is the story of how the most unlikely place in America produced one of its greatest conservation victories. Look at this, 56 square miles of windswept rock sitting in the Pacific, closer to San Diego than some people's commute to work. And unless you have a military security clearance, you will never set foot on it. San Clemente Island is the southernmost of California's Channel Islands, and it is the only place in the entire continental United States where the Navy conducts simultaneous ship-to-shore, air-to-ground, and ground live fire training. Ships shell the coastline, planes strafe the ridges, Navy SEALs run drills in the canyons. Allied forces from Britain, Israel, Japan, they come here to practice amphibious landings, port seizures, and drone attacks. And scattered across this 37,000-acre bombing range are tens of thousands of unexploded munitions. Some the size of 2 stacked trash cans, some the size of a ping pong ball. So many that the Navy has determined it would be more harmful to the environment to clean them up than to leave them buried in the dirt.
And here's where it gets strange. Because on that same island, between the craters in the canyons, tucked into the scrubland that the missiles haven't touched, there are plants and animals that exist nowhere else on Earth.
The San Clemente Bell sparrow, the San Clemente Island paintbrush, the San Clemente Island lotus, the San Clemente Island larkspur, the San Clemente Island bush mallow, and a tiny, fierce songbird called the San Clemente Loggerhead Shrike, a predator the size of your fist that catches insects and lizards and impales them on thorns to eat later. Ornithologists call it the butcher bird. Every single one of these species is endemic to this one island, and their entire world is a live-fire weapons range. And in January 2023, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service officially removed 5 of them from the Endangered Species List, the largest group delisting due to recovery in the 50-year history of the Endangered Species Act.
What gets me about this recovery is how it happened. Not one dramatic rescue operation, but rat traps in the right places at the right time, a food supplement during a dry year, small deliberate actions compounding over decades and pulling this island back from the edge. And I think about that in my own life. The times I've actually changed weren't the result of some all or nothing moment. They were small moves made with a little more clarity than I would have had on my own. For me, it's easy to get lost in my head, and finding someone who can give me a gentle nudge to break outside my typical thought patterns can suddenly give a new way of looking at the world. And that's what therapy can offer. Not a dramatic fix, but a place to think more clearly and more intentionally. BetterHelp, the sponsor of today's video, makes starting easy. Take a short quiz, get matched with a licensed therapist, and meet however works for you, phone, video, or text. And if they're not the right fit, switch anytime at no extra cost. Click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/parkvibes for 10% off your first month.
Okay, let's get back to the story and a time before the bombs when the real destruction was happening.
San Clemente Island has been federal land since 1850, before California was even a state. And for most of its history, it was frontier in the truest sense, a lawless, wind-battered rock that attracted exactly the kind of people you'd expect.
Sea otter hunters came first, stripping the waters around the island. Then seal hunters, then Chinese fishing crews harvesting abalone from the shallows. Smugglers used the island as a waypoint. For decades, San Clemente was a place people went to take things, and nobody was keeping track of what was left behind.
But the most destructive visitors weren't the hunters or the smugglers, it was the ranchers.
Starting in the late 1800s, the Department of Commerce leased San Clemente Island for private sheep and cattle grazing. Thousands of animals, goats, sheep, pigs, cattle, were brought to an island that had never evolved to handle them.
And they did what livestock does on these islands. They ate everything. The native plants that had evolved over thousands of years in isolation.
The paintbrush, the lotus, the larkspur, the bush mallow had no defenses against grazing animals. No thorns to deter sheep, no toxins to repel goats.
These plants had evolved on an island with no large herbivores, and suddenly there were thousands of them.
The goats were the worst. They stripped the hillsides bare, they ate seedlings before they could establish, they turned canyons that had been dense with native shrub into eroded gullies. And as the plants disappeared, so too did the animals that depended on them. The Bell sparrow lost its habitat, the Loggerhead Shrike lost its nesting sites. And nobody talks about this part.
When you hear military bombing range, you'd assume the military was responsible for the problems. But sheep caused the collapse on San Clemente Island. The bombs came later.
And this is where the story took a turn nobody expected. When the Navy took over San Clemente Island in 1934, the civilians left, the ranching leases ended, the ferries stopped running. Armed guards went up and the island went silent, at least between the explosions.
And with that lockdown, something remarkable happened, almost entirely by accident.
The Navy wasn't thinking about the San Clemente Island paintbrush. They weren't trying to save the Loggerhead Shrike. They were trying to blow things up without hitting anyone's house. But by sealing the island for military purposes, they did something that no environmental law, no conservation group, no national park designation had managed.
And they kept everyone else out. No developers, no tourists, no roads to new subdivisions, no beachfront hotels.
For the next 9 decades, the locked gate and live ammunition kept more people out than the Endangered Species Act ever could.
But here's the thing though, isolation alone wasn't enough, because the damage had already been done. The goats were still there, the feral animals were still breeding, the native plants were still vanishing.
Fencing off an ecological disaster doesn't fix it, it just freezes it in place.
And for decades, that's essentially what happened. The island was closed, the bombing continued, and the endemic species kept declining, slowly, steadily, almost invisibly, because nobody was watching.
By 1977, the situation was dire enough that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stepped in and listed several San Clemente Island species as endangered. The loggerhead shrike, the bell sparrow, 4 endemic plants. All of them circling the drain on a single island that also happened to be a live fire weapons range. And then in the mid-1980s, things went from bad to catastrophic.
Picture a bird, maybe 7 inches long, perched on a scrub branch in a canyon. It spots a lizard on the ground, drops like a stone, and snatches it.
And then flies to the nearest thorn bush and drives the lizard onto a spike. Pinned there, a larder. The San Clemente Loggerhead Shrike hunts like a raptor trapped in a songbird's body. It catches insects, lizards, even small mice, and impales every one of them on thorns or barbed wire to eat later. That's why they call it the butcher bird. And between 1985 and 1988, field surveys found between 5 and 11 breeding pairs remaining on the entire island, on the entire Earth. 5 pairs. Think about that for a moment. The entire future of a species, every individual, every egg, every chick, contained within a handful of birds on a 56 square mile rock in the Pacific. One bad storm, one disease outbreak, one particularly hungry feral cat, and they're gone forever. And this was happening on a Navy installation, which meant the Navy had a problem.
Because under the Endangered Species Act, federal agencies aren't just encouraged to protect listed species, they're required to.
The Fish and Wildlife Service had the legal authority to shut down military training on San Clemente Island at any moment if the Navy wasn't in compliance. And with a species this close to extinction, compliance was about to get very complicated. So what did the Navy do? It became a conservation organization.
If this story is surprising you, subscribe, because what the Navy built next on that bombing range is something no one would expect to find.
Starting in the late 1970s, the Navy began its most basic and brutal step, removing the goats.
Between 1977 and 1991, they removed 29,000 goats from San Clemente Island. 29,000.
Animals that had been breeding unchecked for over a century, finally gone. And almost immediately, the native vegetation began to respond. Seedlings that hadn't survived past a few inches in decades suddenly had room to grow. But the Navy didn't stop at removing the problem. They started actively rebuilding what had been lost.
And here's where it gets genuinely surreal. Because on this live fire weapons range, the same island where ships shell the coastline and planes drop ordnance on mock targets, the Navy built a year-round staffed field station.
With a greenhouse for propagating endangered plants and a captive breeding facility for loggerhead shrikes, the only one in the entire Navy.
Wildlife biologists working daily on live fire ranges, tending seedlings in the morning and hearing active detonations in the afternoon.
Military vehicles observing low speed limits to avoid hitting endangered island foxes, driving restricted to specific roads to protect rare plants.
A $5 million annual conservation budget managed by the same command who's actively dropping bombs.
The Navy built a greenhouse on a bombing range, but keeping the plants alive was the easy part. Because saving the loggerhead shrike, the butcher bird, the species down to 5 breeding pairs, required something far more hands-on than planting seedlings. Melissa Booker, the island's wildlife biologist, has spent years counting the shrikes between bomb craters. She and her team monitor every known nest on the island, tracking each breeding pair, each clutch of eggs, each fledgling that makes it to independence. And the threats she manages aren't abstract. They're crawling through the scrub at night. Black rats, introduced to the island long ago, raid shrike nests and eat the eggs. So Booker's team runs targeted rat control around every active breeding territory, setting traps and bait stations in the weeks when the birds are most vulnerable.
During dry years, when insect populations crash and the shrikes can't find enough food, the team supplements their diet directly, delivering food to the territories to keep breeding pairs active and productive.
Research showed that shrike pairs receiving both food supplementation and rat control produced an average of 2.5 more fledglings than pairs receiving nothing. In a population that once numbered 5 breeding pairs, 2.5 extra chicks per nest is the difference between existence and extinction.
And then there are the fire retardant lines. Look at this.
If you pull up satellite image of San Clemente Island, you can see bright red streaks running across the landscape.
Those were drawn by biologists like Robert Wolf, who laid down fire retardant to prevent bombing-caused wildfires from spreading into shrike habitat.
The Fish and Wildlife Service can shut down training at any moment if the Navy falls out of compliance, so those red lines are, in a very literal sense, the boundary between the military mission and the survival of a species. Visible from space, drawn by ecologists holding back the bombs. The annual cost of the Shrike Recovery Program alone, approximately $1.7 million per year, for one species on one island that the Navy was also bombing. And here's what made this program actually work. The military presence itself created the conditions for it. The same security restrictions that kept civilians off the island also kept out the threats that have devastated wildlife everywhere else in coastal California.
Urban sprawl, agricultural runoff, feral dogs, recreational disturbance. Inside that Navy perimeter, the biologists had something almost unheard of in modern conservation, a closed system they could actually control.
On San Clemente Island, the Endangered Species Act and the Department of Defense exist in kind of a forced marriage, each constraining the other, each dependent on the other, and somehow, against all odds, producing results. And now, look at the numbers. The San Clemente Island paintbrush, roughly 1,000 individuals when it was listed, by 2023, over 48,000. The San Clemente Island lotus, 1,340 individuals spread across 9 locations, now more than 21,000 across 249 locations. The San Clemente Island larkspur, there were 2 known populations when it was listed in the late 1970s. One of them had a single individual. Today, there are nearly 19,000 plants across 74 locations. The bush mallow, 290 total individuals, now over 5,600 across 222 locations. And the bell sparrow, that bird that was down to just 38 individuals in 1984, when Melissa Booker redesigned the monitoring protocol, she discovered something remarkable. The sparrow was thriving, quietly breeding in parts of the island nobody had thought to look. The revised population estimate, over 5,400 birds spread across 33,000 acres, 4 times what anyone had previously calculated. In January 2023, the Fish and Wildlife Service made it official. All 5 species I just mentioned, delisted. Removed from the federal endangered species list due to recovery, the largest group delisting in the entire 50-year history of the Endangered Species Act.
The U.S. Pacific Fleet, the same command that oversees weapons fire on San Clemente Island, was nominated for the 2024 Secretary of the Navy Environmental Award for Natural Resources Conservation, for saving endangered species on a bombing range.
But this brings us to the real question, the one that sits beneath all of this story. The ranching era devastated San Clemente Island's ecology far more than the military ever did. Sheep stripped the island bare, shells just left craters. And the thing that saved this place, the actual mechanism of preservation, was exclusion. A locked gate, a security clearance, the simple, blunt fact that almost no human being was allowed to set foot on this rock for 90 years.
And all of that points to something uncomfortable. Some of the most important conservation in America might be happening in the places we can't see. Behind fences, on military installations, in restricted zones that will never appear in a national parks brochure.
And it raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer. What happens when the military leaves? What happens if the Navy decides it doesn't need San Clemente Island anymore? If the gates open and the developers come? If the ferries start running again? The 5 delisted species are still being monitored. The post-delisting plan runs for 9 years, Booker and her team are still on the island, still tending the greenhouse, still counting shrikes, still drawing fire-retardant lines between the bombs and the birds. But that protection depends entirely on the island remaining a place that nobody else is allowed to go. The San Clemente Loggerhead Shrike doesn't know any of this. It doesn't know it was down to 5 breeding pairs. It doesn't know about the Endangered Species Act or the $1.7 million spent each year to keep it alive. It doesn't even know it lives on a weapons range.
It just perches on a scrub brush in the canyons, somewhere in between the bomb craters, spots a lizard, and drops.